thousands of abandoned gold mines across the country have attracted illegal mining activity, which is known to cause disturbances in surrounding communities. Riverlea in the south of Johannesburg has been a hub for years, with residents claiming that zamas are terrorizing them. And in the northwest, it is alleged that some of the illegal miners have been underground for months on end. Have you ever wondered how they manage to survive underground? Well, joining me now to unpack this discussion is Dr. Bjorn van der Heyden, who is a senior lecturer in the Economic Geology Department at Stellenbosch University and also the chairperson of the African Rainbow Geometallurgy Research, and he's now joining us live to have this conversation. A very good morning to you, Doctor, and thank you so much for making time for us. I'd like to start off with the conversation around the rehabilitation of the mines themselves, and then we're going to deal with the other aspects in relation to how some of these illegal miners are able to survive underground for months on end. What's your interpretation of the status of the rehabilitation of mines in the country, whether we speak about pre-1994, before legislation came in, and what then happened after?
Sure. We've got a massive historical legacy of mining in this country. The Wits mining has been going on for over 100 years. Back in those days, there wasn't the legislation in place to ensure that the environment was looked after appropriately and that the rehabilitation steps were put in place. And so that's left us with some big historical legacy issues where the standard of the rehabilitation is not quite up to scratch. And now, fortunately, I think the legislation is in place, so there's a lot more impetus placed upon ensuring that there's funding available towards fixing up the mine sites afterwards. And what we're also seeing is this process of secondary mining, where we go back to old mine sites and reprocess some of the tailings dumps. And I think through that process, we are also helping to rehabilitate some of the historical legacy, but certainly not all of it.
Yeah, then speak to us about the obligation that is placed on mining companies once they do get their license to operate, because the point that has been made is that there is the post the closure rehabilitation, but there is also the rehabilitation that happens concurrently while the operations are still underway.
Sure. So, each mining company is going to have its own strategy towards the rehabilitation. They should have funding set aside at the outset, which goes towards sort of a liability fund to ensure that there is money left over for the rehabilitation that needs to happen at conclusion of the mining operation. I can't comment too much in terms of how much of the rehabilitation happens during the mining operation versus that which happens at the end. Certainly with open cast mining, a lot of the backfill will happen at the same time as new phases are advancing. So I think it's variable on a mine scale, but like I mentioned in my previous paragraph, the legislation is at least there in the modern era. And I think mining companies are very aware that historically mining has a bit of a bad name. And it's something that we are proactively as a sector trying to change. And to do that, to invoke that change and to create a positive sentiment around mining, which is really crucial, especially at this time point where we're sort of gearing towards a greener transition. And for that, we need a range of different metals.
Yeah.
I think that positive sentiment is reliant on mining companies taking their responsibility for rehabilitation very, very seriously.
Yeah, and then what about the state's responsibility when it comes to the rehabilitation and also the monitoring of rehabilitation? So let's say, for instance, some of the companies that operated during the height of apartheid, during colonialism, where there was no legislation to rehabilitate, but of course the holes are still there. What is the state's responsibility when it comes to that, but also the monitoring of the current mining operators when it comes to rehabilitation?
Yeah, so I guess that's a two-part question. I'll speak to the state's responsibility first, and I think that's just unfortunately by default that because the mining companies that operated in the past are no longer going concerns or modern-day entities, the liability has unfortunately had to fall then on the state to rehabilitate or to deal with these sites. And I guess that would fall under the DMR's
Mm.
jurisdiction, or I'm not sure whose jurisdiction exactly it falls under, but yeah, that's just a default.
Yeah.
And then the second part is your questions relates to the modern miners.
Yes, to the monitoring of rehabilitation.
Yeah, so each mining company will have a environmental sector, an environmental officer. The that entire department will be responsible for making sure that the legislated uh, bullet points that need to be met, so that the criteria that need to be met
Yeah.
are being met, and that is that person's responsibility. And like I said, they do take that very seriously.
Yeah. Another question before we move over to the other aspect of our conversation is it really possible to completely seal a shaft after the mine has decided to close down and it is no longer used? It becomes a disused mine, because we see from an insert that we just played now visuals of where there was a closure of some of the shafts with thick concrete that has been put there, but the ability of some of these zamas to actually crack through some of the concrete to make their way into the tunnels. Is it really possible to totally seal off disused mines?
Yeah, so that's again, I think, dependent on the individual mine. I think there's some mines, like for example in Barberton, where they also have big issues with illegal miners. And those mines have been mined for over 130 years, and the hills are really sort of honeycombed with different adits, different entrances, which makes it incredibly difficult. The bit's a little bit more easy, but again, the mining's taken place there for over 100 years as well. And you've got your main shaft, but there's also going to be ventilation shafts. There's going to be multiple different adits for multiple different mining operations. So lots of routes of ingress. And I think then compounding that issue is just how wily these illegal miners are. So they're often getting their hands on things like explosives, and they're able to reopen things that have been concreted closed. So it becomes an engineering problem. I think, if they really wanted to make it completely bulletproof, there would be a way. But like I said, the guys are wily.
Yeah. Let's then speak about the biology, anatomy of a human being. How is it that you can have miners or people underground for months on end? We are told that some people have been underground for up to a year. How is that possible?
So it's an entire network, and I think that's something that's coming out in the media currently, is how ingrained these sort of, or how extensive the fingers of these, I guess you could call them, criminal enterprises really are. And that means that there's individuals that are going down there and taking food down with them, and I've heard of people, illegal miners, paying over 200 rand for a loaf of bread. Because that's the fetching price in that sort of microeconomy that exists in the underground environments. So food, there are ways of getting it down. It relies on other people who are going to surface more regularly. Water and things like Coca-Cola also fetching over 200 rand a bottle. Again, can come down that way. There is groundwater in the area. The quality of that groundwater is not great, and I think you guys have seen images of the state of the health of some of these miners. It's not great at all. There are multiple things to consider there. There's things like acid rock drainage that changes the pH of the water, changes the chemistry of the water, and increases the mobility of ions that can be quite deleterious to human health. But there's also the fact that within these disused mine shafts, the illegal miners are making ablutions underground as well, and that can contaminate the quality of the water that is seeping through the ground. So that's from a food and water perspective. I guess airflow perspective, like I mentioned in a previous response, the hills are honeycombed. There are various old ventilation paths, boreholes were drilled for exploration. So there's airflow down there. It's definitely not as good as a formalized mining environment where there's a dedicated ventilation team that directs the airflow to an active mine face. So the quality of the air is certainly not as good as a formal sector. And I think that's one of the reasons why the formal sector is certainly the preferred sector for mining.
Yeah, and considering how hot it is underground and how high the temperatures are, how come they survived the heat stress that some of us would normally perhaps even collapse under? But here you have the mine workers that are able to survive that.
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure which level these guys are mining at. I mean, the Bits gold mines, mineralization goes right from surface down to depths of 4 kilometers. So I'm not sure what depths illegals are operating at.
Yeah, they said
I'm
about
doubtful that
2 kilometers down.
Okay. Look, I guess that's probably a limit that is implemented by the fact that the human body can't go too much beyond that without proper ventilation.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not a biologist, but I'd imagine they push themselves as far as they can. I'd imagine that they've got some sort of acclimatization within those 8 months. And I guess together they manage themselves. These are pretty hardy individuals, and I, in some respects, take my hat off to them for what they're able to put themselves through to put bread on the table for their families. But yeah, I don't envy them.
Yeah. Some of the other people, and I don't know if you'd be able to comment on this, spoke about giving a family member, brother or something like that, half a tube of Colgate, meaning toothpaste. And I don't know, how does toothpaste help you survive?
I'm not sure
Yeah.
of the chemistry of this. Yeah, I've got no clue. I don't know what they're doing with the toothpaste.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating thing because something that we kept on asking, how does it happen? How does it happen? So what happens with the toothpaste as well, if it's able to assist somebody who is starving, that they're going to use toothpaste just to keep them alive and not die from hunger. But thank you so much for making time for us. Dr. Bjorn van der Heyden, who is from the Stellenbosch University there.